So now that you learned how to set up Flutter and the Android development environment on Windows in the previous lecture, you're going to learn how to set up Flutter and Android and also the iOS development environment on macOS in this lecture. Of course, you can skip this lecture if you're working on Windows. Now, to set up Flutter and all the required tools on macOS, I recommend visiting flutter.dev, and there you can click on Get Started to be taken to the official documentation and there to the setup instructions. Here on this installation starting page, to which you also find a link attached to this lecture, you can choose your operating system, so not the system you want to target, but the system you're on. And here we'll therefore choose macOS. And once you clicked on that, you will find detailed setup instructions. And in general, I recommend going through these instructions in addition to this video, because sometimes some tiny steps change, some links might change, and that's another advantage. On this page, you get direct links to all the tools and all the software that must be installed, and therefore you should definitely also check out these written official instructions in addition to this video. Now, for macOS development on this page, you'll learn that as a prerequisite, you need to have Git installed. I did mention this in an earlier video already. And indeed, Git will be installed for you automatically when you install Xcode. You might also already have it on your system by default, and therefore typically you don't need to install it separately, since we will install Xcode anyways, as we need that to build iOS apps, but you can also install Git separately if you want to. Also important, at least at the point of time I am recording this video, you have a separate setup step that's needed if you are on an Apple Silicon device, so a M1 or M2 or whatever macOS device. And of course, it's possible that in the future this step is not required, which is why you should also check out these written instructions in addition to this video. So here I'll just copy this code here, this command. And then you can open your default system terminal and execute that command in there. You might be prompted to enter your password, and once you did that, this should install some extra tooling or walk through that extra setup step, which is required if you are on such an Apple Silicon device. With that out of the way, you can move on to installing the Flutter SDK, so the Flutter tooling and framework itself. And you should, of course, pick the appropriate version for the macOS device you're on. Here, since I'm on an M1 device, I'll pick this Apple Silicon version and download this zip file. This zip file then will include all these Flutter tools and the Flutter framework. Now I'll wait for this download to finish. And once the download finished, you can unzip that downloaded package. And then with that unzipped folder here, just go anywhere on your system. Here, for example, I'm in my root user folder and created a tools folder there, though that name is absolutely up to you. It doesn't have to be named tools. But in there, I'll create a Flutter folder, and this name is also up to you and doesn't have to be Flutter, but I'll move all the content, all the files that were in that zip package into this Flutter folder here. Again, the exact path and the names of these folders are up to you, but you should store all these Flutter files and all these Flutter tools here in one central place on your system. And once you did that, you must add Flutter to your path, as it's called. You must make your operating system, macOS, aware of these Flutter tools which you just installed. You can run this command here in your terminal to make that terminal temporarily aware of your installation and make sure that this really points to that path where you just moved all these files. But you would have to rerun this command whenever you restart your system terminal. Since this is annoying, you can click on Update Your Path here, or choose this here on the right, and instead update your path permanently to make your system and your terminal permanently aware of these Flutter tools you installed. Now on this page here, you find detailed instructions on how to do that. In the end, you first of all want to find out which kind of shell you're using. for which you can run echo shell, and this should either point you at CSH or bash. If you're seeing bash, you should update a .bash profile or .bash RC file in your root user folder. If it's set shell, as I have it here, you should update a .csh RC file. If you don't have these files, you can simply create them. Here in my case, in my user folder, where those files should be located, I have such a .csh_rc file, and I am using this C shell, so that's therefore the file I should update. And you can do this with a regular text editor. Again, if you don't find that file, you can simply create it, though it might also just be hidden, and therefore you should make sure that you do show hidden files in your Finder. If you then still don't find it, you can create it. Here, as mentioned, I do have it, and I'll edit it with the default text edit app. And in that file, you then should insert a new entry, which is also mentioned here in the official docs, and that should be this entry here. So here I'll just copy that, and then insert it here at the end of this file. And now this entry also must be adjusted, because here, you should point to that folder where you dragged your Flutter files into. So in my case, Tools, Flutter, and then there, this bin folder. Now we already see /bin here at the end, so I just need to replace this path here, this part between the square brackets and the square brackets themselves, with a path to this Flutter folder. Now one of the easiest ways of getting this path is to right-click on that Flutter folder here, and then choose Get Info, and then here copy this where part, paste this in here, and then also add /flutter since that name itself wasn't included, so that overall it should point at your users folder, then at the path where you stored these Flutter files, and then there this /bin folder. Thereafter, you can and you should save this file, and once you did that, you should close and reopen your terminal app. And then in here, if you run which Flutter, you should see that path to that Flutter tooling as an output. You should not get an error that this is an unknown command or anything like that. If you do get an error that this is an unknown command or anything like that, check that path which you added to this .configuration file a couple of seconds ago. And with that, you got Flutter installed. You should now be able to also run Flutter Doctor, which is a command you can run to find out whether everything is prepared for Flutter development on your system. And this should now not give you an error that this command is not found. Instead, this should now do some initial setup work, possibly download some extra packages when you run this the first time, and then thereafter it should show you some output where some steps might still be missing. For example, here I got no Android toolchain set up because I haven't added all these Android tools yet, but Flutter is installed, and in my case I also got Xcode already installed, though I will still show you how to do that later in this video. So you should get some output here, and with that out of the way, we can skip this GitHub step here and instead continue with the platform setup for the platforms we want to cover. Now here I'll show you both iOS and Android setup. You can of course also skip one of the two if you only want to target one specific platform, but here I'll show you both, and I'll start with iOS and Xcode. Now for that you need to download and install the latest version of Xcode, and the easiest way of doing that is to use the Mac App Store. There, if you don't have it installed yet, you should be able to download and install Xcode, which can take a while because it is a quite big tool, as you can tell. So you should walk through that. And once you got Xcode installed, you must run these two commands in your terminal to basically allow Flutter to work with Xcode behind the scenes. So for that, paste them into your macOS terminal. You again might be prompted to enter your password, and that's it. You might not even get a response or some output here, but you also shouldn't get an error. Thereafter, also run this command here to accept all Xcode license agreements. And here you can simply press space to move to the end of this agreement. And once you're there, which can take some time, you should type agree in here and hit enter. And that's all you need to do for Xcode. Of course, I also recommend setting up an iOS simulator so that you can also preview your Flutter project on an iOS device as you're working on the code. For that, you can run this command in your terminal now that Xcode is installed, like this. And this should now create and boot a new iOS simulator, a virtual iOS device, a virtual iPhone, if you want to call it like this, on your system. And whilst we're not using it just yet, we will use simulators, virtual devices like this throughout this course to preview our Flutter apps as we're working on them. Now we're going to skip this step where we create and run a simple Flutter app for now, because we're going to do that in the next lecture. And here I'll also skip the step where we run this app on a real iOS device, which you also can do, because I'll cover this a little bit later in the course. For the moment, for the next course section even, we'll just use this simulator. And therefore here we can instead move on to this Android setup part and quit that iOS simulator because we don't need it right now. Now, if you want to build Android apps on macOS, you also must install all the tools required for that. And most importantly, that's Android Studio, basically the Android equivalent to Xcode. For that, you can follow this link to be taken to the official Android Studio website and download that latest version of Android Studio from that website. Again, make sure you pick the appropriate version for the Apple chip you're on. Now, this is also a rather big file, a rather big tool, so this download can take some while. So here I'll quickly wait for this download to finish before I then finish this Android setup together with you. So now here the download finished for me, and you can therefore open that downloaded file and finish the installation by dragging Android Studio into your applications folder. Now copying that will again take a couple of seconds, as it's a rather big file. And once that's done, you should open Android Studio and walk through this setup wizard. Now here in this wizard, you want to make sure that you install the Android SDK, and here also such an Android API. And you can keep that default path which it suggests here. Click Next. And then make sure you accept all these license agreements and click Finish. Now this will download a couple of packages and tools that are required behind the scenes, under the hood, to build Android apps. And again, this can take a couple of seconds or even minutes to finish. And once this finished, in this window which opens here, you should click on More Actions and go to the SDK Manager. And here in this window, we have to install some additional software. Here in this SDK Platforms window, you should install the latest Android version at the point of time you're watching this by simply clicking on this, by checking this. Under SDK Tools, you should install these build tools here, and also the Android SDK command line tools. You should make sure that the Android emulator is installed and these SDK platform tools, and then click OK and confirm this. And this will now again prompt you to accept some license agreements, and it will then download and install some extra software that's also needed by Flutter under the hood. Now once that's all done, you can confirm this. And thereafter, you should run Flutter Doctor again to confirm that Flutter has everything it needs for Android development, so that it finds all these tools that you just installed. For that, in your terminal, run Flutter Doctor. And now at this point, this should give you some green check marks for Xcode and Android. And if it does not, as it does for me here, it might even show you what you have to do. For example, here I need to run Flutter Doctor -- Android licenses to accept some additional license agreements. So I'll quickly copy this, and for me it actually messed up the formatting here, so I'll fix this to make sure this is in one line, and confirm this with Y, and accept these licenses by typing Y for each of them. And with that, if you run Flutter Doctor again, you should now also have a green check mark for Android toolchain, and if you installed Xcode before, also for Xcode, and of course for Flutter itself. If you don't have that green check mark for Android, if Flutter somehow can't locate Android on your system, you should try running this command, which is also recommended in the official Flutter documentation. Well, and with that, the last step that I want to go through here is that I also want to set up an Android emulator so that we also got a virtual Android device for testing our Flutter projects. For this, you should first of all enable VM acceleration on your machine if available. If it's not available, that's also not the end of the world, but you should try to enable it if possible, following the instructions on this page, to which you're linked from the Flutter page. And with that, go back to Android Studio, and here under More Actions, open this Virtual Device Manager, and in there, click Create Device to create a new virtual device blueprint. Now here you can choose from a broad variety of templates, and I'll simply use a Pixel 6 here, though you can of course use any template of your choice, and click Next. Then select a fitting Android version. Here I'll simply pick the latest one at the point of time I'm recording this. And you might need to download this when going through this wizard for the first time, which is what I'm doing here. Again, as always, this might take some time since it again is a rather big file. And with that successfully downloaded, we can continue and mostly keep all the default settings, though here for emulated performance, you should actually choose hardware GLES 2.0. Unless this causes any problems later on, in which case you can switch back to automatic. Here I'll choose that though, but keep all the other defaults, and then click Finish. And with that, you got that blueprint created. Now you can click this play button here to start this emulator based on that blueprint. And from now on, you can of course always restart that if you're diving back into Flutter development. You don't have to go through all that setup process over and over again. And you will get your Android emulator, which is now booting up here, which can then be used to preview your Flutter app on an Android device as an Android app. At the moment, we don't have a Flutter project yet, but that will of course soon change. And now we got all the prerequisites we need to create Flutter projects and to then run them as iOS or Android apps on their respective simulators. Now what's really important, if you get stuck at any point or if you're facing any problems, use that official documentation. And of course you don't need to go through all these steps again and again every time you dive back into development. You only need to do this once. From now on, you can create new Flutter projects and work on these projects without going through all these steps again and again.